The gunshot cracked across the valley before the sun had even cleared the ridge, and by the time Ethan Cole reached the fence line, he found not a wounded animal, but a woman standing over a dead rattlesnake with her husband's revolver still smoking in her trembling hand. She hadn't slept in 3 days. She hadn't eaten in 2. And she hadn't said a single word to another living soul since the funeral. That morning, staring at a stranger who had wandered onto her land looking for work, something in her cracked open, and she whispered the sentence that would change both their lives forever. Your ranch is too big for one woman alone, then stay, and take care of it, and me. If you believe in second chances, in kindness shown to strangers, and in the quiet kind of love that grows out of grief, hit that like button right now, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, share this video with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to Golden Outlaw Tales so you never miss a story like this one. Now, let's step back into that dusty Montana morning and see how it all began. Ethan Cole had been walking for 6 days when he crossed onto Hartwell land. He was not a drifter by choice. The war had taken his brother, the bank had taken his family's farm in Missouri, and the only thing left to his name was a coat 2 sizes too big and a pair of boots that had worn through at the heel. He had heard, from a tired old man at a trading post 2 towns back, that there was a widow out past Copper Creek running 2,000 acres of cattle country all by herself since her husband had been thrown from a horse and broken his neck in the spring. Nobody expected her to hold on to the place. Nobody expected her to hold on to anything, least of all her sanity. Her name was Margaret Hartwell, though most folks in town still called her the widow, as if grief had erased the rest of her identity. She was 34 years old, sharp-eyed, sunburned across the nose, and carrying a grief so heavy it had begun to calcify into something colder and harder than sorrow. She had buried her husband Daniel in March, and by June she had buried the hired hands too, one by one, as they quit when they realized she could not pay them through the winter. The ranch, once the pride of the county, had begun to rot at its edges. Fences sagged, the barn roof leaked, 60 head of cattle had wandered off into the hills because there was no one left to mend the gaps in the wire. When Ethan appeared at the edge of her property that morning, rifle-less, hat in hand, asking only for water and maybe a day's work in exchange for a meal, Margaret nearly turned the gun on him instead of the snake. She had grown to fear men who wandered in with soft words and empty pockets, men who wanted to take what was left of a broken woman's land and call it charity. But there was something in the way Ethan stood, something exhausted and honest, that made her lower the revolver instead of raising it. She told him there was a trough behind the barn and he could drink his fill, but that was all the charity this ranch had left to give. He didn't leave. He fixed the trough's broken pump without being asked, using wire and a bent nail, and by the time the sun had climbed to noon, he had already mended 40 feet of fence line along the northern pasture. Margaret watched him from the porch with her arms crossed, telling herself she was simply making sure he didn't steal anything, but the truth was she hadn't seen a man work like that, quietly and without complaint, since Daniel had been alive. She fed him that evening. It was the first meal she had cooked in a week that wasn't eaten standing over the stove alone, staring at nothing. The following weeks unfolded slowly, the way healing always does, in small and unglamorous moments rather than dramatic turns. Ethan slept in the old bunkhouse and rose before dawn to work the fences, round up strays, and repair the barn roof plank by plank. He never asked Margaret for wages, and she never offered any beyond food and a roof, because both of them understood, without saying so, that neither had anything left to give beyond labor and shelter. He was a man trying to outrun his own grief through exhaustion. She was a woman trying to survive hers through control, and somewhere in the rhythm of shared work, in the silence of two people who understood loss without needing to explain it, something began to soften between them that neither was prepared to name. There were hard days, of course, because no story of healing comes without its storms. A summer drought threatened to kill off what remained of the herd, and Margaret spent whole nights awake calculating whether she could afford feed through August. The bank sent a letter reminding her that Daniel's loan was still outstanding and that foreclosure remained a very real possibility if the next payment was missed. Ethan found her one evening sitting on the porch steps with that letter crumpled in her fist, and for the first time since he'd arrived, she let herself cry in front of another human being, not delicately, but with the raw, ugly sobbing of someone who had held herself together with sheer will for far too long. He didn't try to fix it with words. He simply sat beside her in the dark, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and let her grief exist without trying to rush her out of it. It was around that time that the town began to talk. A widow living alone with a strange drifter was scandal enough for a place with little else to gossip about, and Margaret found herself facing whispers at the general store and cold stares at church. Some said Ethan was after her land. Others said worse. She told herself she didn't care what anyone thought, but the loneliness of being watched and judged wore on her just as heavily as the ranch work did. One afternoon, a local rancher named Thomas Briggs rode out to check on her, though everyone including Margaret understood his true intention was to buy the Hartwell Ranch for a fraction of its worth while she was too broken to negotiate fairly. He spoke to her the way men often spoke to widows they assumed had no fight left in them, gently condescending, offering pity dressed up as generosity. Margaret sent him off her land with words sharper than any she'd used since Daniel's death, and it was Ethan, standing silently by the barn with a shovel in hand, whose quiet presence gave her the courage to stand her ground. That night, sitting by the fire because the autumn chill had begun creeping into the valley, Margaret finally spoke the words that had been building in her since the day she nearly shot a stranger over a rattlesnake. She admitted that she had been terrified of losing the ranch, terrified of losing herself, and terrified most of all of admitting that she needed anyone at all. She told Ethan that the two of them had built something out of nothing in just a few short months, and that the land, which had once felt like a tomb she was trapped inside, had slowly begun to feel like a home again. And it was there, with the fire casting long shadows across the cabin walls, that she said the words that had first drawn him to stay all those weeks before, only this time they carried a different weight entirely. "Your ranch is too big for one person," she told him, her voice steady now instead of broken, "so stay, and take care of it, and take care of me too, not as a hired hand, but as something more permanent than that." Ethan did not answer with words. He simply reached across the space between them and took her hand, calloused palm against calloused palm, two people who had lost everything finding in each other a reason to build something new. It wasn't a grand romantic gesture, no sweeping declarations or dramatic embrace, just two survivors quietly choosing one another after months of proving, through labor and patience and shared silence, that they were worth choosing. By the following spring, the Hartwell Ranch looked unrecognizable from the broken, grief-stricken property it had been the year before. The fences stood straight, the herd had doubled, the bank loan had been paid off through a combination of Ethan's relentless work ethic and Margaret's fierce refusal to be pitied out of what was hers. The town's gossip faded, as gossip always does, replaced eventually by grudging respect for the woman who had refused to lose her home and the man who had helped her hold on to it without ever asking for anything beyond a place to belong. If this story touched something in you, if you found yourself hoping for these two broken souls to find their way to each other, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need a little reminder that second chances are real, and subscribe to Golden Outlaw Tales so we can keep bringing you stories like this one. And before we go, we have one small request. If there was a single line, a single moment in this story that touched your heart, please type it in the comments below. We read every single one, and your words remind us why we tell these stories in the first place. Margaret and Ethan never had a grand wedding or a fairy tale proposal. What they had was steadier and, in its own way, far more beautiful. Two people who had been broken by loss, who found in each other not a replacement for what they'd lost, but a reason to keep going, one fence post, one sunrise, one quiet evening by the fire at a time. And on that ranch in Montana, too big for one person to carry alone, they built a life large enough for both of their grief and both of their hope, together.